Thank you very much to the Foundation. Thank you for Taurus being here. And let me very briefly address the issue on hand before I give the floor to Timothy Garton Ash. This is a wonderful book. Timothy's books in general are wonderful. It is the history of the present that he writes about. And this is a genre which also comes alive in this work. I think we could read it as a history of Europe between World War II and the Ukrainian War, and it is more or less that. Let's see what happens after World War II. But two more things that Timothy's books always are, which is a journalistic achievement. In other words, yes, he relays the information and he goes to where that history has taken place and he talks with the persons involved. In this book, Timothy speaks with Gorbachev, with George Bush, with Helmut Kohl, with Felipe González. So he really does have first-hand statements, which is much more than what historians usually achieve. And it's also a little bit of a remembrance of sorts. Timothy has lived in Europe. He studied in Berlin, in East Berlin, where he was actually spied upon by Stasi, and he actually has written about that. He has traveled all of Europe, and it is a triple book. So it's history of Europe, it is a journalistic oeuvre, and a book of the personal memories. So I switched to English.
Thank you very much for those kind introductions. It's wonderful to be back here in Madrid, if at a slightly dramatic moment. One of the, for me, most characteristic things of being a European is the sense that you can be at home abroad. I'm in Madrid. Last week I was in Copenhagen, I was in Stockholm, I was in Athens. You're abroad, but also because you're a European, you're at home. And that seems to me the unique feature of being a European, which explains the English title of this book, Homelands. We can have homelands in the plural. Poor old Americans only have one homeland, as in Homeland Security. But we Europeans are lucky enough to have many. This book took me just 50 years to write. 50 years traveling around the continent, as you just said, witnessing events, meeting figures who made this history, writing it all down in little notebooks like this one, in which I may record something about this evening, studying Europe in more conventional ways, in archives and libraries, worrying about Europe, writing about Europe. And it's an unusual genre. It's history illustrated by memoir and reportage. So it's full of these stories that you mentioned about these encounters, but the stories are there to illustrate the history. So for example, I'm walking through the Berlin Wall the day after the Berlin Wall comes down, walking across the death strip to East Berlin, where just 2 days before people would have been shot for crossing the other way. And I meet a young East Berliner who says he's just seen an improvised poster which says, "Only today is the war really over." That's not just an anecdote. I think it's profoundly true that only in 1989 was the war really over for the whole of Europe behind the Iron Curtain. 2 years later, I'm sitting opposite Helmut Kohl in his office in Bonn. Helmut Kohl has just succeeded in uniting Germany. Anyone here met Helmut Kohl? I know Joaquin has. I'm sure one or two of you have, yes. Helmut Kohl was the largest human being I have ever met. He was enormous, both in height and in girth. And he's towering over me, and suddenly he says, "By the way, Professor, do you realize you're sitting opposite the direct successor to Adolf Hitler?" conversation stopper if ever I heard one. What does one say? If I'd been quick enough, what I should have said was actually, Herr Bundeskanzler, there was Grand Admiral Dönitz between Hitler and you. Because actually Grand Admiral Dönitz was the last Chancellor of the United Germany before Helmut Kohl. But I was far too gobsmacked to say anything at all. But of course, Helmut Kohl was saying that for a reason. He was making a very serious point. I'm aware of my historical responsibility. Hitler wanted to put a German roof over Europe. I'm going to put a European roof over Germany, which he did. 3 years after that, I'm at a conference in St. Petersburg, full of goodwill between the West and Russia, except for one rather unpleasant-looking little man, some kind of sidekick of the mayor of St. Petersburg, who on the second day of this conference rather spoils the good atmosphere by piping up and saying, we have to remember that there are territories that were historically always Russian, and we in the Russian Federation have a duty towards them. And he specifically mentions Crimea. And he says there are 25 million Russians living outside Russia, and we have a duty to look after them. 1994. You guessed. His name was Vladimir Putin. Don't tell me the eastward enlargement of NATO, which only started 5 years later, is the cause of Putin's aggression against Ukraine. The imperialist revanchist instinct was there all the way back in 1994. So each story illustrates a history, and the history is a story of Europe and freedom, the two leitmotifs of my life's work. So when I started, you mentioned this, traveling to Europe as a very young man in 1972-73, most Europeans still lived under dictatorships. This will be surprising news to most young Europeans today. We did the sums. 289 million Europeans lived under democracies, 389 million under dictatorships. Not just the whole of Europe behind the Iron Curtain and in southeastern Europe, but of course Greece, Portugal, and Spain. Spain was still under a dictatorship. And starting with the wonderful end of the dictatorships in southern Europe in the mid-1970s, and painting with a broad brush, you have an ascending curve in the spread of freedom and democracy across Europe, which marches together with Europe. So Europe and freedom march together. Through 1989, the spread to East Central Europe, to the Baltic states, to Southeastern Europe, to Ukraine, and an unprecedented enlargement of Europe, the European Union, and the geopolitical West. 6 members in 1972, 27 by 2007. NATO, 15 members in 1972, 26 by 2007. Of course, it wasn't a continuous, uninterrupted period. There were 5 wars in former Yugoslavia, there was 9/11, but nonetheless, painting with a broad brush, this broad ascending curve. Interestingly, 9/11 does not seem, with hindsight, to be the big turning point in European history. It's a big turning point in US history and Middle Eastern history, not so much in Europe. In Europe, the big turning point is 2008. The simultaneous eruption of the global financial crisis and Putin's seizure of 2 great chunks of Georgia, both within a month of each other, summer, autumn 2008, start what I call a cascade of crises going down through the next 15 years. The global financial crisis segues into the Great Recession, and as you know very well in this country, the Eurozone crisis. In 2010 already, Viktor Orban starts demolishing democracy in Hungary, so that you now have a full member state of the EU which is no longer a democracy. 2014, Putin does what he was talking about 20 years before, in 1994. He actually goes and seizes Crimea and starts the war in eastern Ukraine, because as Ukrainians always remind us, this war didn't just start last year. It started more than 9 years ago. 2015, the refugee crisis, Brexit, Trump, the spread of populism, COVID pandemic all the way down to the 24th of February 2022 and the beginning of the largest war in Europe since 1945, as you mentioned, so that unexpectedly the book is bookended by the end of one big war and the beginning of another in Ukraine. I argue that that full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the war that is still going on to this day ended what I call the post-wall era. So we have the post-war period from 1945 to 1989, and then what I call the post-wall period from the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 through to the 24th of February 2022. And one of the questions of the book, well, I mean, there are two things in the book. One is the question, why? What went wrong? Why, after things seemed to have gone so well for so long, did we go into this downward turn, into this cascade of crises? I think a large part of the answer is our old Greek friend, hubris in multiple variants, and underlying it, a fundamental mistake in the way we think about history. Basically, in the early to mid-2000s, we came to think that we knew which way history was going, and that as things had gone, namely rather well, things would continue to go. So we turned history with a small h into history with a capital H, a Hegelian process of the inevitable progress towards freedom. But nothing in history is inevitable. And that's also the good news, because if the continuation of that upward curve was not inevitable, nor is the continuation of the downward curve that we're in at the moment, right? It's always up to us. And that's the second point of the book, which is to say to my fellow Europeans, and I write as an English European, young and old, but particularly young Europeans, who tend to take this Europe for granted, hey guys, we have built the best Europe we have ever had. I insist, the best Europe we have ever had. If you can find me a better one in history, I'll be interested to hear about it. But it's now seriously under threat. And as we saw in former Yugoslavia, as we've seen in Ukraine, as we've seen in many countries in Europe, in Hungary, for example, it can very quickly be unraveled. All those achievements can be demolished. And therefore, we need to mobilize to defend this Europe that we have created. So that's a very, very brief introduction to the book. And on that note, I know that, the thing about being a historian is when you go and talk as a historian, people always want to ask you about the future. So I know you'll be most interested in the future, so I look forward to talking about the present and the future with Ramón, but I just wanted to give you some sense of this book before we go into that conversation. I look forward very much to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy. At the beginning of the book, you tell us that your father was among the British soldiers that landed in Normandy in the D-Day, and he fought the Nazis, and he contributed to the liberation of Europe. And 60 years after the D-Day, you wanted to be in the place where your father was fighting, in the north of Germany, and you met one man who was the son of one of the German soldiers that your father defeated 60 years before. Your father could have killed the father of this man, and the other way around. But you liked each other. You were more or less the same age. You strolled in a boot where there had been very dramatic killings in the Second World War, but you became more or less friends. And then you say, identity is something given to us, but it is also something we create. We cannot choose our parents, but we can choose who we become. those two Europeans, the sons of two soldiers, chose to be friends, to talk friendly in the north of Germany. And I would say, as you have said, that most Europeans chose that identity, that this would be our identity in the future. We would be more or less friends. We would have an identity based in liberalism and democracy and a kind of internationalism. Would you say that we still believe in that identity that we so firmly believed 20 years ago when Spain became a member of the European Union after when signed the Maastricht Treaty, or when the countries in the European East were becoming members of the European Union? Do we still believe in that identity?
I do. But the honest answer to your question, I think, is who is the we in that sentence? I've been to Ukraine 4 times since the beginning of the full-scale war. In Ukraine, every second word is Europe. I have never met such passionate Europeans as in Ukraine at the moment. So those aspiring to be members of the European Union have this passionate belief in Europe as their future and as the guarantor of their freedom and security and democracy. Another group of really passionate Europeans are British Europeans like me, because we lost it. I say in the book the 2 largest pro-European demonstrations I have seen in recent times have been in Kiev and in London. I will never forget that we were demonstrating against Brexit and for a second referendum. A sea of European flags encircling the Duke of Wellington's house in the centre of London. I mean, just a huge demonstration. Banners saying things like, I love EU, I love you, and so on. So I think it's situational. The larger point I would make, Ramón, is that if you look at the way the argument for Europe has been made in different European countries over the last 60, 70 years, it always has the same form. We were in a bad place, we want to be in a better place, that place is called Europe. Europe had no shortage of bad places, different bad places. For Germany, it was the Nazi past. For France, it was the past of defeat and occupation. For Spain, it was a fascist dictatorship. For Poland, it was a communist dictatorship. For Britain, it was economic and political decline. We all had our own bad places, but the shape of the argument was the same. We've been in that bad place. We want to be in a better one. It's called Europe. The problem comes when you're in it. And this, I think, is the problem we're beginning to have, that we have a generation of young Europeans who've taken everything we have achieved in Europe for granted, and who now have an uneasy feeling that things are getting worse. I would say particularly in Southern Europe, because of the Eurozone crisis. This may sound familiar to you. And they're not so sure that Europe is guaranteeing them the better future. So I think we do have a problem, and a problem, oddly enough, not so much at the periphery of Europe, but at the heart of Europe.
You speak in the book about what you call, I am sorry because I've read the book in Spanish, so maybe I'm not translating it back to English in the same way that you wrote it in the first place. You talk about the memory engine, if I'm not wrong. And the memory engine has been changing in the last 70 years. You talk about what we might call the founding fathers of Europe, who still remember the First World War. You talk about the generation of Helmut Kohl, who were not old enough to fight the war. You talk about the 68. You're a little younger than that, I would say, but I'd say this is the generation of Felipe González, for example. And then you talk about the generation of 1989, the generation who saw how the Berlin Wall fall down. And I would say, as you were talking, that maybe I am a member of the crisis generation, who were young enough to feel that that crisis would mark their life forever. how do you think that this memory engine, that thing that keep us reminding that Europe is a better place, will change in the future for my generation and the next one?
Great question. So I'm speaking in the German university town of Göttingen and just laying out the argument you've summarized, which is that the Europe we have has essentially been created by 4 generations, each of whom was shaped for life by formative experience in their youth. The first one is actually what I call the 14ers, those who were shaped by youthful experience of the First World War. I mean, think about it. Konrad Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill, Alcide de Gasperi. It was the First World War. The 39ers, the Second World War generation, the 68ers, and the 89ers, those who experienced that wonderful year, that year of wonders as young people. There are probably several in this room. So I'm laying out this argument, and then a student gets up from the back of the room and says, do you think there'll be a generation of 22ers? It's a great question. We have the largest war in Europe since 1945. We have a sense that the whole European project is challenged quite fundamentally from outside and from inside. Is there going to be a generation of younger Europeans, slightly younger than yours? Because I think the 2008 Eurozone crisis generation is a more specifically South European phenomenon.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Right? It's specific to a few countries which were hit very badly by the Eurozone crisis. What you need is a pan-European generation. These were all pan-European experiences. Now, I would love to believe that that's going to be true. I would love to believe that we can see a generation of 22ers mobilizing across the continent. But I don't know what other people in this room think. If I'm honest, I have my doubts. I see it in Ukraine. I see it in the Baltic states. I see it elsewhere in Eastern Europe. But the further west you go, by the time we get to Britain or Ireland, or Spain perhaps, or Italy, I don't see it so much. I don't see it being such a formative experience for that generation. So part of how I see my own job, because the job of the historian is to enable people to learn from the past without having to go through it all themselves, is to try and generate the consciousness for a generation of 22ers.
There's something that you've mentioned before, and that is, it's a very important part of the book. You've written a lot about the fall of the Berlin Wall, how it fell down, and the impact that it had in a lot of people who had been living most of their life under totalitarianism, only communism or Nazism and then communism, both in a very short period of time in some cases. And first of all, I don't know if people my generation or younger will remember what was communism and how dreadful it was. But also, I don't know if they will believe something that your generation and mine did together, I think, that was thinking that in the 90s it was the end of history. We thought that the good people has won, capitalism has won, liberalism has no rival. Even though we can like or dislike the term of the end of history, I think there was some optimism in that era, and that we were a little arrogant. And you say that you thought that we thought liberty was a specific kind of capitalism, a specific kind of economic model, and that probably we were wrong. How do you think about that era now?
So let me just start with the fall of the Berlin Wall, because the challenge is, how do you bring home the character and excitement of these events to people who weren't even born in 1989? And so I do it by telling human stories. So I tell the story of my closest East German friends. The son fled via Hungary to Austria in summer 1989. And he thought he wouldn't see his family again for many years to come. But there is a station of the S-Bahn, the city railway in Berlin, where because of a peculiarity of the divided city, the S-Bahn, the city railway, goes over East Berlin. And so he made a date with his little sister and little brother. He went to stand on the platform up there on the West Berlin City Railway. They stood down on the street below, and they just shouted to each other. How are you? Achim, Achim, how are you? How are you doing? It's this excruciating scene. And they thought they wouldn't see each other for years to come. And then this miracle happens, and the wall comes down. And Joachim's father, Werner, my dear friend, thinks he's going to drive across. And so in one of the first waves of people going through the crossing, which has just been opened at Bornholmer Strasse, he goes across with his daughter and a friend. And they go across just for half an hour because they left the kids at home sleeping. And then they turn around to come back. And then his daughter's friend says, Werner, please stop the car. And Werner stops the car, and she just opens the door and just puts one foot on the ground. The West. She can't believe it. She's in the West. And Werner wonderfully describes it. He said it was like Armstrong on the moon. 1 foot on the moon. And telling a story like that, you can try and get through to people what it was like. Now to your question. So we knew it was a miracle. We knew it was like walking on the moon. And then as time went by, and by the way, I don't think we made the mistake so much in the 1990s. I think it came later. Mm-hmm. We gradually came to think that this was inevitable. The French philosopher Henri Bergson talks about the illusions of retrospective determinism, the almost irresistible temptation to think that what actually happened had to happen. But it was nothing but inevitable. It was a 1 in a million example of historical luck, what Machiavelli calls fortuna. But we came to see it as inevitable, I would say in the early to mid-2000s, more than in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. And by the way, my friend Francis Fukuyama has such a tough time of it. Everybody says to him, oh, Francis Fukuyama, it wasn't the end of history. No, that's not what I meant. Yeah. I meant history with a capital H, not with a small h. But we did start making that mistake in the early to mid-2000s, and just when we'd convinced ourselves that history was inevitably going our way, it started going wrong.
There's a joke that you tell in the book, a Soviet joke, I think. Timothy tells that Marxist intellectuals had been thinking how to turn a capitalist society into a communist society for decades. And they had more or less an idea about how to do it, but they had no idea about how to turn a communist society into a capitalist society. And the joke says something like, we knew how to turn an aquarium into a soup fish, but we didn't know how to turn a soup fish into an aquarium. Yeah. Do you think it's not as radical as it was back then? But are our societies changing? Are our liberal societies, liberal democracies changing into something else? Of course, it's not a change as radical as it was back then. But are we changing into something else?
I think we're still aquariums or aquaria, depending on your preferred plural, of a very varied kind. But the problem is, if we are aquariums, we're aquariums with a lot of very unhappy fish. So one of the points of the book was liberal self-criticism. If I'm talking about this downward turn, about what went wrong, we have to understand what we got wrong, our own mistake. And one of our mistakes, and I speak as a liberal European, and liberal in the broadest sense, small L liberal, is that we quite rightly devoted a lot of our time to the other half of the world. We tended to neglect the other half of our own societies. And it wasn't just a question of the inequality of income and property, what you referred to, economic, the reduction of liberalism to the economic, it was also what I call the inequality of attention and respect. A lot of people in our societies felt they were just not being taken seriously. They were being ignored, not respected by remote, liberal, metropolitan, cosmopolitan elites. The Polish populists have a very interesting phrase. They talk about the redistribution of respect, not just of money, the redistribution of respect. And then the populists came along and seized on that electorate. So that one of the great challenges for us, as in the broader sense liberal Europeans, and I mean liberal left and liberal right and liberal center, is how to win back that other half of our societies, which is still tempted, very strongly tempted, to vote for the populists.
As you know, and I'm not going to ask you for that directly, as you know, it's a very peculiar moment in Spain, political moment in Spain. In Spain, at least for my generation, we tend to see as if for the last century, I'd say, Europe was a kind of a solution for most of Spanish problems, for problems with dictatorship, with problems with modernity. We expected that Europe would solve most of that problems, and I would say that it certainly did. From the 1980s on, the generation that made Spanish a fully European country achieved things that were, I wouldn't say new, but kind of new in Spanish history. At the point that I would say that my generation took that for granted. We were Europeans, we were in a liberal democracy, it would go on forever, as you said, for the rest of Europe. I'm not going to ask you for the peculiar situation in Spain now, but there is something interesting when I was reading your book, that in the situation now in Spain, both sides of the political debate are still thinking that Europe is the solution. A lot of people on the right is thinking that if what is happening with the government now is wrong, Europe will help us to address it. The other part of the debate is saying Europe will recognize that we are doing the right thing. I'm not asking you about the specifics because they are very difficult, and I'm not going to ask you, but what do you think when a Spaniard or the Spanish debate is still thinking that Europe is very much a part of the solution to our problems?
So, I mean, first of all, as I hinted in my opening remarks, for me, Spain is a classic case of how Europe and freedom and democracy march together. That's how I think of the Spanish story, as being a wonderful example of that. And so obviously, you know, it's concerning if that's in question. Two comments. First of all, the European Union has tremendous normative power when countries want to join it as accession countries. Once countries are inside the EU, it turns out that they can do pretty much what they like, and the normative power is much, much less. And I think that it's becoming increasingly apparent that that is a major problem of the European Union. I'm not going to talk about Spain specifically, but let me talk about a really extreme example, which is Hungary. Another mistake that I and my friends made was to believe that countries like Hungary and Poland were consolidated democracies, and that their democracy would be guaranteed and secured by their membership of the European Union, right? And then it turned out, not a bit of it, that Viktor Orban was able to dismantle and demolish a democracy in Hungary, not just in spite of his EU membership, but using actually your tax euros, I mean, using billions of EU funds. So I think, stepping back from the specifics of the Spanish case, there is a structural problem which the EU is going to badly need to address if we're going to make a success of enlargement, because we're in prospect taking on a number of countries which, to put it mildly, might have authoritarian tendencies. The second comment I would make is that I think it's always been a mistake to, so to speak, outsource the defense of democracy or the rule of law to Europe, to believe that Europe is going to do it for you, right? In the end of the day, it's always up to us to defend democracy and the rule of law.
I'm going to make you my last question before opening the floor. Something that you ask yourself in the beginning of the book is something we have all asked ourselves in a different way. What do we talk about when we talk about Europe? And you say we talk about at least 4 different things. There is geographical Europe, something on the earth which goes from, I don't know, Lisbon to Moscow or Istanbul. There's a history that most of the time we link to Western Europe more than Eastern Europe, I would say. There's something we link to culture and values that begins with Rome and then goes with the church and Christianism and Enlightenment and liberalism. And then there is what we call the European institution, which is quite new. And there is something that you say after that, whatever Europe is, its language is translation. Mm-hmm. Europe's language is translation. We translate each other all the time. But as you say, and this is something I must say that I use sometimes, wherever we are, even when we need translation, we feel at home abroad. Mm-hmm. I was in Italy 1 month ago, and I felt kind of at home, and I hope you feel at home here too. As you can read in this book, I think Timothy does not mention that literally, but I say it might have another subtitle, which might be a love story. You have a kind of a love story of Europe. Most of Spaniards, I would say, we have a love story of Europe. How would you say, if it's a geographical, a cultural, a historical, also a linguistic reality, what's your relation of Europe with Europe after those 50 years, thinking, traveling, writing, as you have done?
Well, I remain a passionate European, an English European, someone with many homelands. They exist. No, don't laugh. There are quite a lot of us, actually, and we're coming back too. So I mean, Europe is my life. I'm a passionate European. But if I can just pick up on something you said, I mean, you know, this is not a book simply about the European Union. It's about the real Europe, which is 50 different countries, different languages, different cuisines, different ways of being, different ways of life, which yet have all these echoes and things in common. So it's that diversity. And the key to the future of Europe is to find the right balance between unity and diversity, right? So for 2,000 years, we Europeans have been having this love-hate affair with Rome. On the one hand, ever since the end of the Roman Empire, we've been trying to recreate the Roman Empire, right? Already in the 6th century, Theodoric, a barbarian leader, tries to recreate Rome. Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire. Napoleon. It's no accident that it's a treaty of Rome. And on the other hand, we've been trying to escape from Rome. There's a very good book by a Stanford historian, Walter Scheidel, called The Escape from Rome, right? So whenever it gets too tight, too united, countries pull away. There have been many Brexit. It's not just the Brits. So what follows from that is that the key to securing the future of Europe, particularly as we enlarge the European Union, is not to go full speed ahead for ever more Europe, the United States of Europe. It is to find that elusive balance between unity and diversity, between Rome and not Rome. And that, for me, is the key to keeping the European Union alive and kicking for the next 50 years.
I said it was the last question. I lied. Just one very short. Should we enlarge the European Union?
Emphatically, enlargement is the great success story of the European Union. After all, Spain wouldn't be part of the European Union unless it had been enlarged. And it's not only because these are European countries that want to be democracies and part of the European Union. It's not only their own desire. it's also because we are now in a world of giants, of non-European great and middle powers. It's no longer just the United States and us. It's Russia, it's China, it's India, it's Turkey, it's Brazil, it's South Africa. And in a world of giants, you've got to be a giant yourself. So actually that enlargement, if done right, will also enhance our European power. By the way, particularly if we've got a President Trump coming down the tracks, which is entirely possible next year, it will also enhance our European power so that we can defend our own interests and our own values in this quite rough and tumble world.
No tenemos tiempo para más, lo siento de veras.
We don't have any more time because Timothy has a previous engagement. So thank you very much.